They're coming. They're coming your way. They'll be here soon. Will you be ready?
For a lot of kids nowadays, the introduction to horror is plentiful. You got games that are just safe enough to be parent approved, TV shows that can be easily accessed online at any time, and most horror movies nowadays are PG-13, and even if it were a rated R movie, then kids nowadays can just wait a month or two, and then they'll just be back up on HBO or Netflix or Hulu or whatever service that you pay. Pick your poison, there's like 50 of them. Really, anyone can watch any horror film they want. But back in the 80s and 90s, when most horror films were made exclusively for adults, and parents thinking games were the product of Satan, it was a lot more difficult to get your hands on spooky stuff as a kid. That is until 1993, when here in the States, a book series swept the nation with its unique approach to horror, that being horror aimed directly at children, Goosebumps. It was an interesting take on the way horror was produced because at this point in the early 90s and late 80s, kids weren't really allowed to watch any horror movies whatsoever. A lot of them were rated R. We had to just sneak into theaters to watch some of the scary stuff adults kept talking about, like Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, and a slew of other classic horror films that were in the theaters at the time. And like I said, back then horror films were often rated R, so for a lot of us, it was our first time seeing naked girls and a ton of gore. Yeah, it was cool, but maybe a little too much for some more fragile minds. Enter R.L. Stines, a novelist who at the time was known for making children's literature and worked on a few Nickelodeon projects. Before working on Goosebumps, R.L. Stine showed his love for horror through a different series of books he called the Fear Street books, aimed for a younger audience and a much less talked about series. His love for horror and his writing talent would then soar to greater heights when Scholastic and Parachute Press decided to collaborate and launch R.L. Stine's Goosebumps series in 1992. The book was a massive hit amongst kids, you know, back when kids actually read books. No, seriously, the 90s was the last time you'd see books get commercials on TV, and boy, they must have worked really well, because they made R.L. Stine's a household name seemingly overnight. Although as effective as I'm sure these ads were, a lot of the credit in Goosebumps' success has to go to the legendary cover artist Tim Jacobus. His Goosebumps art was incredible, and more so than that, eye-catching. I know we're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, but damn, when your covers look as cool and as interesting as this, oh, you can't help but be interested. That's not to discredit Mr. Stine's writing. The man was a master of cliffhangers and twist endings. It's what made his books such page turners. You really couldn't just stop reading these things, and there were dozens of them. From 1992 to 1997, R.L. Stines had published 62 Goosebumps books, each of them as memorable as the last. Well, okay, maybe not too memorable. Yeah, actually reading back on some of these, they can be kind of cheesy and a little goofy at times. I mean, keep in mind, this isn't horror made for us, and by us I mean the general demographic of 18 to 30-year-olds. I mean this was made for kids ages 7 and up, so of course most of the horror was dialed back to meet the expectations of children. Nowadays, I'd argue your average kid is desensitized to a lot of this stuff, like scary dolls coming to life. That's nothing. Have you ever seen Freddy fucking Fazbear? That dude is a zombie robot thing that'll just stuff your mangled body into an animatronic while you're still alive. Like honestly, if some of these kids just went back in time and saw some of the shit that we were into, they'd laugh at us and just call us dweebs. But of course, as scary as the books were, we can't ignore the absolute classic television series that is Goosebumps. Airing first in 1995 and ending in 1998, Goosebumps brought almost every book to life, as well as having their own ideas, making each one just an episode long. Now, you might think that half an hour might be too short to really capture every nuanced thing that made the original book it's basing itself on scary, and yeah, you'd be right. I mean, these books are short, don't get me wrong, they're all averaging around 120 pages each, which could be read by most people in about a day or two, but 120 pages condensed to 24 minutes? Well, I mean, hopefully that doesn't lead into anything awkward, right?
No! No! No!
Yeah, needless to say, the show was just about as cheesy as the books. Even for the 90s, this stuff was corny. Keep in mind, the 90s was a turning point in kids' media in general. It wasn't just Goosebumps changing the way horror was being made, but stuff like Mortal Kombat was changing the way we viewed video games. WWE was changing the way we viewed wrestling. The Simpsons changed the way we viewed cartoons, and a slew of other things made this otherwise violent content more available to kids. And when Goosebumps was coming out as a TV show, well, it was entering a bold new world, but also needed to be kid-friendly enough for mom and dads to be satisfied with. Still, I won't say the show wasn't scary. I actually really liked the episode titled The Haunted Mask, which was about, well, a haunted mask, and I think most people actually really enjoyed that episode. I think the mask is still very creepy, but the part where she tries to get it off her and she's just freaking out, noticing that part of her body is basically just becoming the mask, telling everyone that she's not herself anymore, and she slowly begins to transform into this horrible creature. I mean, that's just classic horror. And of course, how can you mention this episode without mentioning the absolute freaky scene where she visits the mask maker and there's just a bunch of floating masks and they have this distorted voice and they're just like begging her to join them, and it's so terrifying. It's still vivid in my memory to this day. I mean, have a look. Other than that though, with the limited time each episode had to work with, give or take around extra 20 minutes if you're special enough, I think the show worked well for a sort of baby's first horror, if you will. Need I remind you that this stuff wasn't made for us. It was made for a new kind of horror audience, a much younger demographic. And while that doesn't excuse it for being bad or being totally cheesy, it was a one-of-a-kind experience. But that's not to say that adults like us can't enjoy Goosebumps. It is a very well-written show, and again, R.L. Stines is a very talented writer who knows what he's doing when it comes to the twists and turns, and there's still some spooky stuff that even us as adults can find totally eerie. They're a lot of fun, regardless of who they're made for. And I feel like that speaks in volumes of R.L. Stine's writing. It was like the Twilight Zone for us back then, except in color and not as boring. Nowadays, R.L. Stine still makes horror for a younger audience with his latest series called The Haunting Hour, hitting TV around 2014. And of course, we can't forget the recent Goosebumps movies that have been coming out in the past couple of years, featuring Jack Black as, of course, R.L. Stine's. Although I am a bit sad to say that Tim Jacobus's art has been replaced with newer iterations of the book's publishing, and I gotta say, I'm really not feeling it. They're just too colorful and they just sort of lack that creepiness that made the old covers classic. Now they're just sort of modernized and not in the best way. Not that they're bad or anything, they're just not the first images that come to my head when I think horror, let alone Goosebumps. Oh well, book covers might have changed, but the stories are still there. The show is still there. Here's to the man who got me into horror. May he continue to show everyone just what it means to get goosebumps.
Have a scary day, everyone.